In this video, I'm going to attempt to provide some information that may help you in the event that your country is under nuclear attack. This primarily applies to a scenario in which there is an exchange of strategic nuclear weapons between NATO and the Russian Federation, with an emphasis on survival within the United States. If you primarily watch this channel for online anonymity or cubes-related content, I won't blame you for skipping this one. This is just something I've always been interested in, and especially so since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. I also realize, as I write this on February 20th, 2025, that the threat may be on the verge of dissipating for now. But until nuclear weapons are hopefully done away with, this information will still be relevant. Anyway, there are, of course, many videos like this on YouTube and elsewhere, but I find them deficient in several ways. Otherwise, I wouldn't be making this video. The deficiencies are as follows. First, these videos do not tend to be very rigorous about what likely targets would be under attack. Many of these videos speak of something like the top 20 cities. For other targets, they may mention Los Alamos National Laboratory, but seem completely unaware of other nuclear weapons sites, such as Pantex plant near Amarillo, Texas, Sandia National Laboratory in Albuquerque, New Mexico, or Kansas City National Security Campus in Kansas City, Missouri. But rather than offering my own best guesses of targets, I will show you documentation from FEMA that attempts to assess the damage from a hypothetical nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union from the late 1980s. Next, these videos do not seem very informed about the current nuclear posture of the US or Russia, and most seem uninformed on the yields of the weapon systems. A recent example that I think exemplifies this common misunderstanding was in an article on Zero Hedge, which described what a 20-megaton warhead would do to Washington, D.C., New York, or whatever city. The yields of the strategic nuclear weapons fielded by both the US and Russia are now generally between 100 kiloton and 1 megaton. For comparison, the two bombs dropped on Japan in World War II were approximately 15 kiloton. In case you're unaware, a kiloton is the explosive power of 1,000 tons of TNT. 1 megaton is the explosive power of 1 million tons of TNT. Today, these weapons dropped on Japan would be considered tactical nuclear weapons, as crazy as that may sound. The extremely large yield weapons, such as the 20 megaton example, were common in the 1970s, but by the turn of the century, they were essentially all retired from service. The United States has one remaining weapon, the B-83 gravity bomb that is believed to have a yield in excess of 1 megaton. While a 1 megaton weapon would cause catastrophic damage the likes of which have never been seen before in war, it does matter when establishing what a safe distance is from a presumed target. 20 megaton weapons are a relic of the past, when ICBM missile accuracies were so poor that war planners could kill a target even if the missile missed its target by an entire mile. Finally, the videos I see do not emphasize the threat of nuclear fallout nearly as much as I believe is warranted. The FEMA report I previously mentioned attempted to assess the level of nuclear fallout by county within the United States. The results were truly sobering. The levels of fallout severity were classified as very high, high, medium, and low. If you were sheltering in a typical American house without a basement, your probability of death from very high, high, and medium fallout levels is 100%. By their calculations, 47% of the U.S. population would be included in this range, and every single person without an adequate fallout shelter would die. If you have a basement, which equates to a PF factor of around 10, you stand a chance of surviving in the medium fallout range, but you would still have acute radiation sickness. I'm sure many of you are skeptical of these claims and are suspicious that FEMA was trying to scare the general public for some reason. But I do not believe this is the case. This report was published in 1987, but not for public release. As the cover page indicates, limited distribution, not for public release. This report was only made public in 2005 through a Freedom of Information Act request. Anyway, there are a few mitigating factors between the late 1980s and today in terms of exposure to fallout. One is that Russia used to have far more deployed warheads than today. The FEMA report uses some established numbers from 1985, which was about 7,800 deployed warheads, then making some unstated adjustments to estimate how many warheads would be fielded in 1990. Today, Russia fields only a fraction of that, about 1,600 in total. Another factor is that the U.S. has fewer ICBM missile silos today. In almost any strategic nuclear war scenario, Each of these missile silos would be targeted by a Russian ICBM warhead and detonated very close to the ground to ensure the silo is severely damaged or destroyed. The single most significant factor in how much fallout is generated in a nuclear detonation is the height of burst. For an air-burst detonation, the height of burst is calibrated to cause maximum overpressure damage. This is intended for soft targets like cities and industrial targets to cause the maximum damage over the widest possible area. For an optimal airburst detonation, the fireball of the weapon does not touch the ground. The only fallout is generated from the weapon itself, which is sucked up into the mushroom cloud and into the upper atmosphere and distributed roughly equally around the world. The fallout from an airburst is quite negligible. The bomb detonated over Hiroshima was an airburst, so there was very little radiation apart from the initial blast. For a hard target like a missile silo, the weapon will be detonated on the ground or at very low altitude. With a ground burst, the radioactive isotopes of what is left of the weapon mix together with dirt and debris from the ground, generating a tremendous amount of highly radioactive material that falls back to the ground for hours and days after the detonation. So basically, the risk of fallout is almost entirely determined by whether you are downwind of a hard target like a missile silo, runway, or command and control bunker, or if the warhead radar fails and fuses upon impact with the ground. Anyway, there used to be ICBM missile bases both in Missouri and South Dakota that are no longer present. North Dakota used to have 2 ICBM bases, but the one in the east part of the state, Grand Forks, no longer has any ICBMs. Despite these mitigating factors, I still think fallout is still a grossly underappreciated danger that must be seriously considered if you want to survive a nuclear war. In the next section of the video, I'm going to cover the likelihood of a nuclear exchange actually happening. See the timestamps in the description if you want to skip it. In both the public consciousness as well as in our institutions in the West, the idea that a nuclear war could actually happen in modern times is something that is considered so unlikely that it is dismissed as essentially impossible. I believe this assumption is extremely naive, considering the number of times NATO and the Soviet Union almost stumbled into nuclear war by accident. I think the fact that we are all alive today is by luck, not from the wisdom of our leaders. There's a Wikipedia entry titled, List of Nuclear Close Calls. This includes both accidents and false alarms. By my count, in 15 of these incidents, nuclear weapons could have been used if circumstances had been slightly different. There could very well be many missing from this list that are not publicly known due to classification issues, and therefore are hidden from the public by NATO countries or the Russian Federation. Here's a few noteworthy examples. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, a Soviet submarine, which had been out of contact with Moscow for several days, found itself under apparent attack from American ships that were dropping depth charges, trying to force the submarine to the surface. The captain feared World War had already erupted and interpreted the depth charges as an attempt to destroy the submarine. He ordered preparation to fire a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo at the American ships. Use of this weapon required concurrence from the 3 most senior officers on board. Only one of them, Vasily Arkhipov, vetoed the decision. Robert McNamara, the U.S. Secretary of Defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis, has been quoted as saying, "This was not only the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in human history." In one insanely terrifying incident in 1979, NORAD detected the launch of 250 ICBMs from the Soviet Union. NORAD notified the National Security Advisor, stating that a decision of whether to retaliate was needed by the president within 3 to 7 minutes. Within minutes, the number of detected incoming ICBMs increased to 2,200. Fortunately, before any final decision was made, early warning radar systems were able to confirm it was a false alarm. An investigation revealed that a training scenario had been inadvertently loaded into the computer system responsible for issuing the alert. 2 major close calls occurred in 1983 alone. The first being in September, where a Soviet early warning system satellite detected the launch of 1 American ICBM, then 5 further launches. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov of the Soviet Air Force may have very well saved the world by convincing his superiors that the Americans would not launch a handful of missiles in a first strike. By his reasoning, they would launch hundreds, all at once, and not just 5. Shortly after this, in November of 1983, NATO conducted a nuclear war exercise codenamed Able Archer 83. Since 1981, the Soviet leadership had convinced themselves that the United States was actively planning a nuclear first strike, This extreme level of paranoia, partly on the thinking that U.S. President Ronald Reagan would be crazy enough to order something like this, led them to conclude that Able Archer was a cover for this long-planned actual nuclear first strike. So the Soviets had readied their nuclear forces and were convinced a nuclear attack was imminent, while NATO was essentially oblivious to this fact. If this had coincided with another early warning false alarm, full-scale nuclear war could very well have occurred. Finally, in 1995, a scientific research satellite was launched from Norway. The Russians were given advance notice of this launch, but the message somehow did not reach the necessary personnel in the Russian government. On top of that, the missile's altitude and trajectory closely resembled a Trident submarine-launched ballistic missile. From the Russians' perspective, it was conceivable that this single missile was designed to be used as a high-altitude EMP, aiming to blind the Russians' radars to further missile launches. The Russians took this threat so seriously that the Russian equivalent of the nuclear briefcase was taken to Russian President Boris Yeltsin. The world may have been saved by the circumstance of Yeltsin not being drunk at the time. To what degree there was a real risk of nuclear war from these examples is, of course, up for debate. Judge for yourself how close we came, then consider the words and actions of the governments in the US, Europe, and Russia today. The recklessness of the Russian government is obvious and needs no explanation. However, in the past, the US would arm, equip, and train insurgents fighting against Soviet forces, such as in Afghanistan, but would do so clandestinely. Today, Western leaders openly brag about supplying Ukraine with advanced weaponry. Month by month, weapons that were once considered an unacceptable risk of escalation, risking a direct war between NATO and Russia, are eventually supplied out of desperation to keep Ukraine from collapsing. The general public seems to have been convinced, at least up until recently, that the collapse of the Soviet Union took nuclear war off the table in terms of things to worry about. But nothing magical happened regarding nuclear weapons when the Soviet Union collapsed. Russia and NATO each still have approximately 1,600 strategic nuclear warheads currently deployed with a total of about 6,000 in stockpile. As previously noted, these strategic weapons generally range between 100 kiloton up to around 1,000 kiloton. These are weapons sitting on top of ICBMs in silos, or on SLBMs in submarines, or on cruise missiles or gravity bombs that can be loaded onto strategic bombers on short notice. Fortunately, both the number of weapons and the yields have decreased substantially since the 1980s. But if a substantial portion of them were used, the result would still be catastrophic. Hundreds of millions and possibly billions of people would eventually die of direct effects, fires, nuclear fallout, contamination, and global famine due to the complete collapse of agricultural production and supply chains. And all of this isn't even taking into account the very uncertain severity of nuclear winter. The first step to surviving a nuclear war is avoiding the direct effects, meaning blast damage and fire. If you're within range of direct effects, no fallout shelter or stockpile of food and water is going to matter. To determine if you live somewhere safe from direct effects, we need two pieces of information: what the likely targets would be and the maximum yield of the warhead. From what I've been able to gather, the maximum yield of any Russian warhead in their current stockpile is 800 kiloton. If you've been listening to any other YouTube channels or reading articles about nuclear war scenarios, this yield may seem low to you. This is because in the past, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, warhead yields were indeed much larger. The reason for this is that bomb technology had far outpaced missile accuracy, so extremely large yields could compensate for inaccurate missiles in terms of destroying a given target. However, in the past several decades, missile accuracy has increased greatly, allowing smaller warheads to achieve the same objectives. Smaller warheads also allow putting a large number of warheads on a given missile. Today, nearly all ICBMs and SLBMs are capable of carrying multiple warheads. This is referred to as a MIRV configuration, standing for Multiple Independently Targetable Reentry Vehicles. As the name suggests, each warhead can be assigned a different target. So although yields have reduced, the total destructive power on each missile is just as large, if not greater, than with a single large warhead. Anyway, we know the largest Russian warhead is probably 800 kiloton. So what are the probable targets? I've done some research on this myself. Likely targets would certainly include ICBM silos, warhead storage facilities, military bases of any kind, any infrastructure related to nuclear weapons, any runway long enough to be used for B-52 bombers, large power plants, and war-supporting industry, at minimum. Rather than give an exhaustive list of potential targets, I would recommend checking out the previously mentioned FEMA report. In Appendix A of this report, they have a map of all 50 states plus U.S. territories, showing areas affected by blast and fire damage. To provide an example to demonstrate how to determine if you will personally be safe from direct effects, I chose Vermont, a state with just one target. The affected areas aren't explicitly labeled, but it appears this target is the city of Burlington. Not being familiar with Vermont, I wondered what the purpose of hitting Burlington would be, since it isn't the state capital and even today has a population of only about 40,000 people. Doing just a bit of research on Wikipedia provided the probable answer. The Lakeside Avenue manufacturing plant, which has been producing weapons systems since the World War II era, run by General Electric, then later Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics. By the way, this is a good indicator to look for in terms of targets. If a company like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Honeywell, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, or similar have a plant in your city, it's most likely a target. Anyway, now that we know Burlington is probably a target, navigate to nuclearsecrecy.com/Nuke Map. Here I placed an 800 kiloton airburst detonation over Burlington. If you happen to live in or near Burlington, this can give you an idea if you stand a chance of surviving. If you live near Ground Zero in the tiny yellow circle, you will be instantly vaporized and will have no idea what hit you. The next circle in gray indicates moderate blast damage, which means most residential buildings collapse. The orange circle after that indicates the extent of thermal radiation that will cause third-degree burns to any exposed skin. Most flammable structures in this radius will also be set on fire. The final circle indicates light blast damage, which means windows are likely to break. Ideally, you should live outside this radius, which is about 12 miles from Ground Zero. Broken windows will make it much more difficult to insulate your shelter from fallout and contamination. So with the combination of the FEMA report and Nuke Map, this should give you an idea if you live in an area that is potentially survivable. The next step is to make sure you have an adequate fallout shelter. To help illustrate this, let's look at the fallout generated from a ground burst detonation in Burlington, assuming northeasterly winds. Ideally, you wouldn't want to be within any of the colored regions, due to the increased risk of cancer. But in terms of survival, you really don't want to be in the orange region. Placing a marker right in the middle shows a radiation exposure of about 470 rem, assuming you live in a single-story house without a basement. Rem is a measure of biological damage of absorbed radiation. Assuming you are not caught outside during fallout and the primary threat is gamma radiation, 1 rem is equal to 1 rad, for all practical purposes. It's generally accepted that the LD50, which means a dose required to kill 50% of people, is between 400 and 450 rem. So, at 470 rem, you will more than likely die and have severe radiation sickness either way. Given that medical care would likely be inaccessible, the fatality rate will in reality be much closer to 100% than 50%. If you have access to a basement, this reduces the absorbed dose to about 90 rem. This certainly isn't ideal from a cancer perspective, but you will live. However, keep in mind, this is the result of a single warhead. A full-scale nuclear attack would include multiple warheads detonating in fairly close proximity. If there are hard targets near where you live, the fallout may include multiple overlapping clouds, significantly increasing the radiation compared to this example. As a grim illustration of this, here's some recent simulations of what the clouds of fallout from the 3 ICBM missile bases would look like. Each of these bases have over 100 ICBM silos, so we would expect more than 100 ground burst detonations in each of these locations. The black and purple regions represent fatal doses of radiation. For people without a fallout shelter, life or death depends on which direction the wind happens to be blowing on that day. Keep in mind, these are clouds from the missile silos alone, and not from other hard targets like command and control bunkers and runways. To protect yourself from fallout, it's important to understand exactly what fallout is. Fallout is basically unstable isotopes of various elements. These isotopes will spontaneously decay into lighter atomic elements and emit some combination of an alpha particle, which is basically a helium atom with no electrons, a beta particle which is a free electron, and/or a gamma ray. Inside your home within the hours and days following the blast, your primary concern is the gamma rays. These gamma rays will emit from particles on the ground, on the roof of your house, and on any structures or trees surrounding your house. They will pass right through any material, similar to an X-ray, but the material will reduce their intensity by the time they get to you. Fortunately, these gamma rays do not impart any radioactivity to anything they pass through, so food and water will not be affected by gamma rays. Also fortunately, fallout decays in intensity much faster than is commonly understood. After 7 hours, the fallout intensity will already be only 10% of what it was originally. After 48 hours, the fallout intensity will only be 1% of the initial intensity. So the first 48 hours are crucial. You will need to shelter as much as possible during those first 2 days. Protecting yourself from these gamma rays depends on 2 factors: distance and mass. The more distance and mass between you and the fallout particles, the less radiation dose you will absorb. Distance can be a massive advantage to your protection if you happen to be in a very tall office building. For a 20-story building, for instance, the ideal location would be on the 10th floor at the very center of the building. This is especially true if the building isn't something like an apartment building with balconies. The fallout will largely be on the ground, 10 stories down, and on the roof, 10 stories above you. For the mass, also known as shielding, the reduction in radiation due to the mass between you and the particles is commonly expressed as the protective factor, or PF for short. Different materials will have a different overall attenuation, and therefore a different halving thickness, which is the thickness of the material required to reduce the radiation intensity by 50%. This chart from Modern Survival blog shows the thickness of various materials and the total amount needed to achieve various levels of protection. Lead requires only 0.4 inches, where wood requires 11 inches. It is generally recommended to aim for a PF of 1000, which requires about 10 layers. Your home will have some base protective factor itself, due to the mass of the house itself, and the distance between you and the particles that fall on the roof, trees, and ground outside. For a single-story house with no basement, this will yield a PF of 2. For a single-story house with a basement, this would be a PF factor of 10, and for a 2-story house with a basement, a factor of 15. So for a single-story house with no basement, you'll need a shelter of PF factor 500 to reach an overall PF factor of 1000. For a single-story house with a basement, you'll only need a PF factor of 100. The reason the basement is so beneficial is that as long as you're in the corner of the basement, you're completely protected from 2 of the 4 directions horizontally. And since the roof of the house is a full 2 floors above you, you get the benefit of the added distance. This is even more so with a 2-story house. In my opinion, concrete is one of the most effective low-cost materials for shielding. With about 16 inches of concrete, you get a PF factor of 100. With 24 inches, you get a factor of 1000. 4 by 8 by 16-inch concrete blocks are commonly available at hardware stores for around $2 each. These can be easily stacked to provide protection in the horizontal directions. However, the trouble you will encounter with any shielding material is safely placing a sufficient amount of material overhead, especially without a purpose-built structure. If you have the resources and know-how, there are construction plans for fallout shelters that can be easily found with a DuckDuckGo search. If you are particularly wealthy, you could get something like this from Atlas Survival Shelters and have them install it on your land underground. For this video, I'm assuming you are not wealthy and do not have expertise in construction, so I will instead focus on more of an improvised, temporary solution. One option is to get a heavy-duty squat rack, also known as a power rack. This is something I have actually done, so I have some personal experience with. You will want to get one with the highest weight capacity you can find, so it won't be cheap. They will go for somewhere between $1,000 and $1,500. This one I found on Amazon advertises a weight capacity of 1,500 pounds. You'll need as much capacity as possible because the concrete blocks are 33 pounds each, and that adds up fast. The idea here is that you place the safety bars at the ceiling level of your shelter, ideally with at least enough space to sit down inside. You then create the ceiling with beams of some kind that run perpendicular to the safety bars, then stack concrete blocks on top of the beams. Then you surround the power rack with stacks of concrete blocks. If you place the shelter in the corner of a basement, you'll only need 2 walls of blocks. For my prototype of this, I made the beams out of 4 by 4 inch lumber. I placed 4 layers of concrete blocks for a total of 16 inches, which is a PF factor of about 100. For the walls around the power rack, I placed the blocks lengthwise, so that I got 16 inches of concrete on all sides. Make sure to build the walls high enough such that gamma rays coming from any direction will have to pass through 16 inches of concrete. so your walls will need to be higher than the ceiling itself. Place the rack a small distance from one of the basement walls to serve as your entry point. To give you an idea, I included a picture. I placed my shelter very close to a basement wall, so I did the best I could with the vantage point. Another similar option is to use industrial shelving. I have another prototype that uses something very similar to the shelving here. I placed the bottom shelf such that I had enough room to lie down inside. Each shelf is claimed to be rated for 2,000 pounds. I derated this by half for safety, placing 2 layers of blocks on the 2 bottom shelves, which works out to about 900 pounds each. Neither of these designs will be comfortable, but they could very well save your life if the unthinkable were to happen. I should mention that I did not do a similar D-rating for the power rack. For the weight rating of the power rack, I'm assuming it is not only D-rated by the manufacturer, but also that the rating is made for the scenario where a loaded bar is dropped on the safety bars, not for a static load as we have here. However, if you implement either of these designs yourself, I would strongly urge you to not get inside of them until absolutely necessary. Also, make sure to keep children or pets from playing in them or near them. Given the weight placed overhead, I do not need to describe the consequences if they were to collapse on top of you. As a final disclaimer, I would also urge you to consult a structural engineer or construction expert if you intend on creating something similar. You may also consider using an even more conservative D-rating factor for a greater margin of safety. But at the same time, these 2 prototypes I created are still standing, more than 2 years later. An absolutely vital piece of equipment you will need is something that can measure the level of radiation. For this section, I'm going to focus on meters that aren't incredibly expensive and are readily available. You may be able to find more professional gear for this purpose, but you can't order them off Amazon, and they may cost hundreds, or even in the low thousands of dollars. If you go on Amazon, you will see numerous models of Geiger counters from numerous manufacturers. The problem is, however, that nearly all of them are useless in the context of radiation levels from the first days and perhaps weeks from nuclear fallout. Consider this chart, which not only demonstrates the hazard from different levels of radiation, but also that most commercial Geiger counters are unable to operate at radiation levels that would actually pose an immediate threat to your health. Based on my research, this chart is completely accurate in that most commercial Geiger counters max out at 100 millirad, or 1/10 of a rad per hour. Given that radiation from nuclear fallout could be 10 rad per hour or higher, this is totally inadequate. Fortunately, there are a few devices that operate at this level. My recommendation is this device, the Nuke Alert. As the name suggests, the Nuke Alert is designed to alert the user of dangerous radiation levels. Whereas most commercially available Geiger counters max out at 1/10 of a rad, this is the lowest level of radiation that will cause the Nuke Alert to begin chirping. Levels are indicated according to this chart, where the radiation level is indicated by the number of chirps. At around 50 rad per hour, it chirps continuously. During a nuclear war scenario, once the device begins to chirp, it's time to enter your fallout shelter. After 48 hours or so in your shelter, the device can be used to verify that it's safe to leave your shelter, at least within the confines of your home. It may be useful to have more than one of these, not only for redundancy, but also to have an idea on the radiation levels outside your shelter. If you place one on the ground floor of your house, you may have an idea of what levels of radiation your neighbors may be exposed to. When deciding between the Nuke Alert and other Geiger counters, one feature worth considering is whether the unit is capable of surviving an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP. In a nuclear war scenario, it is quite probable that Russia would detonate several ICBM warheads up in space as a precursor to the main attack. Each of these would generate a tremendous EMP that would be quite likely to damage electronic equipment. So phones, computers, and even cars may not function after this EMP. The Nuke Alert device was actually tested at a Naval Warfare Center facility with electromagnetic fields, representative of high-altitude nuclear EMP conditions. According to this report, the device continued to function properly. All of that said, it would also be valuable to have a radiation meter in the lower range, both to accurately measure the gamma-ray exposure within your shelter, as well as give you an idea when it's safe to travel outside your house. For this, I would recommend this meter, the better Geiger S2. This is a more conventional style meter with a digital display. The maximum level it is capable of reading is 10 rad per hour, which is actually quite high for a relatively inexpensive and readily available commercial device. But it can also read all the way down to background levels, so it would give you a better idea of when it is safe to leave your shelter than the Nuke Alert. The Nuke Alert will stop chirping when levels fall below 100 millirad per hour, which is still quite high for chronic, long-term exposure. For long-term chronic exposure, a good rule of thumb is to aim for 10 millirad per hour or less. This is well above background levels of about 1 millirad per day, but can be endured without ill effects other than an increase in the chance of cancer over time. The only caveat I would provide with this meter is that I am less certain that it would survive an EMP when compared to the Nuke Alert. The next category of preparations I would recommend is materials to seal off your house. Immediately after seeing a flash of intense light outside, your first step is to take shelter away from windows and behind heavy objects to avoid being hit by flying glass. As much as duck and cover is mocked as being a futile exercise in an overall hopeless scenario, at certain ranges from the blast it could definitely save your life or prevent serious injury. Be sure to remain in your cover for at least a minute, as it may take 30 seconds or more for the blast wave to arrive. Once the blast arrives, your next priority is preparing for the fallout. To prevent radioactive dust from entering your house, you should first shut off your heat or air conditioning and seal off all vents in your house with duct tape. If you do have broken windows, these need to be sealed off somehow. One option is plastic sheeting that can be taped or stapled. It's important to make these as airtight as possible. The distance and mass your house and shelter provides is useless if the dust is blowing around where it can settle directly on your body, or even worse, being directly inhaled. One of the more harmful radioactive contaminants in the fallout that will pollute the environment following a nuclear detonation is iodine-131. Iodine-131 can exist in gaseous form at ambient temperatures and easily forms compounds with other elements, which are in turn dissolved into water. This isotope is very dangerous since it's difficult to completely eliminate exposure and is very radioactive, having a half-life of only 8 days. On the other hand, due to the short half-life, exposure is only a concern for a few months after detonation. The primary danger to your health posed by iodine-131 is thyroid cancer. The thyroid readily absorbs iodine of any kind, including 131. Upon landing there, this radioactive iodine will blast your thyroid with beta and gamma radiation, doing tremendous damage. Fortunately, there is an effective way to mitigate this danger, which is potassium iodide tablets. These tablets contain something like 500 times the daily recommended dose of iodine, which will saturate your thyroid and therefore limit the uptake of iodine-131. I feel I should emphasize that this is the one and only benefit from taking potassium iodide tablets. They protect your thyroid from iodine-131 and nothing else. They do not protect you from alpha, beta, or gamma radiation from other sources at all. You can find these tablets on Amazon for about $20 a pack currently. 1 pack per person should be sufficient. If you need to leave your house for any reason, especially before radiation levels outside are less than 10 millirad per hour, it would be advisable to have disposable hazmat-style suits on hand. This would include a suit with a hood, such as this, gloves, and ideally boots to cover your shoes. This will protect your skin from alpha and beta radiation. To protect your face and prevent inhaling alpha or beta particles, I would recommend a full mask respirator with P100 filters. At the bare minimum, I would use a standard N95 mask combined with eye protection. After venturing out and returning to your home, you will need an area separate from your main living area for decontamination. A garage would be ideal. This space would be used to carefully remove these garments and clean any exposed skin. This could be accomplished with some sort of camping shower, if you have sufficient water supplies. More on that later. At minimum, you should have plenty of wet wipes to clean any potentially exposed skin. As a precaution, you may want to completely shave your head. If you get any radioactive dust in your hair, it will be much more difficult to wash it out, as opposed to just using wet wipes on your shaved head. These wet wipes and your disposable suit should then be placed in some container or trash bag and placed as far away from your living area as possible. The ultimate goal here is to clean your body of any potential radioactive dust and prevent any of it from being tracked into your living area, as well as to avoid any additional gamma radiation from the contaminated garments and cleaning materials. Regardless of how much water you store in your prepping supplies, eventually you will run out and need to find another source. I would not count on having running water, and if you do, it may not be safe to drink. In fact, all water that is not in a sealed container prior to a nuclear fallout situation should be treated as suspect. Filtering and disinfecting water is well understood, and there is plenty of information out on other prepping channels you can find all over YouTube, so I will not cover it in detail here. The only advice I would offer that may be different from other prepping channels is to emphasize the importance of treating the water for microorganisms. Even if you're using a filtration device that claims to remove 99.99% of all bacteria, I would still recommend treating the water with unscented bleach or water treatment tablets, just to be absolutely sure. It is likely that far more people will die from drinking untreated water than from drinking radioactive water. Filtering water to remove radioactive contamination is unfortunately a bit complicated. First, to clear up any misunderstanding, water itself cannot be radioactive. It is the radioactive particles and dissolved solids and gases within the water that is the threat. The reason I say it is complicated is that no standard water filtration technology, be it reverse osmosis, activated carbon, distillation, hollow fiber membrane, or ion exchange filter, can completely remove all radioactive contaminants by themselves. Of the above, reverse osmosis is probably the best single option, but it will not remove iodine-131, which can exist as a dissolved gas within contaminated water. As strange as it may sound, an improvised filter made from nothing more than a bucket, some towels, pebbles, and soil is still the most effective single method for filtering out about 99% of all radioactive contaminants. This design is taken from the 1987 edition of Nuclear War Survival Skills. I left a link to the PDF in the description. I own the 2022 updated edition that still includes this filter, lest you think this advice is outdated or superseded. You basically take a bucket of some kind, poke some holes in the bottom of it, and place a layer of pebbles at the bottom. Then you place a cloth towel on top of the pebbles, then about 6 inches of soil, then another towel, then finally some rocks to hold the top towel in place. You then need some sort of collection bowl that's wider than the bucket. Cover the collection bowl with sticks or rods of some kind, then place the bucket on top. This bucket filter is good for about 12 gallons before the soil needs to be replaced. If you're harvesting soil from a contaminated area, make sure to dig down about 4 inches or more to ensure your filtering soil isn't itself contaminated. You will then need to disinfect the water with bleach or other water treatment product. Before drinking, I would run the treated water through some sort of standard activated carbon filter. I would suggest a Big Berkey type filter, but these seem to have fallen out of favor recently for a variety of reasons. There are plenty of effective alternatives. Do your own research. If you have enough water to last 2 to 3 months, then iodine-131 will be much less of a concern, since it has a half-life of only 8 days. After 90 days, the amount of iodine-131 in the environment will be reduced by more than 99.95% compared to what it was originally. The remaining contaminants we need to worry about then are primarily strontium-90 and cesium-137. Strontium-90 is particularly concerning because it gets picked up by bones in a similar way to calcium. With a half-life of nearly 30 years, it will remain in your bones and teeth emitting beta particles for basically your entire life. As mentioned before, a good way to eliminate almost all contaminants in your drinking water is reverse osmosis. The problem with reverse osmosis, though, is that most of them require electricity to operate. The very few that don't instead require a manual hand pump of some kind. Of the few of these I've surveyed, they don't seem very reliable, or at least not reliable enough for a life-or-death situation. After doing quite a bit of research on this topic, the solution I've settled on is zero water. On top of numerous other contaminants, zero water filters will remove 100% of strontium and cesium. That said, zero water does have a few drawbacks. One is that zero water filters will last, on average, only 40 gallons before they need to be replaced. These filters are also not cheap, currently going for $12.50 a piece on Amazon. The filter life is highly dependent on the quality of water being filtered. So one way to dramatically extend the filter life is to pre-filter the water with a Berkey or similar competitor. In a situation where you're harvesting water from a lake or river, I would consider this pre-filtering step to be mandatory, since the zero water filter will not last long at all in such a situation. Probably 8 gallons or less. Every zero water system comes with a TDS, or Total Dissolved Solids meter. They recommend that once the filtered water reaches 6 parts per million, the filter needs to be replaced. One concern with water filtered to this degree is that it also eliminates all minerals from the water as well. If you're eating a very poor diet of emergency food supplies, there's a very real possibility that you may not be consuming enough electrolytes. In the extreme, This can be deadly. So, I would advise you to stock up on vitamin and mineral supplements. Key electrolytes, which include sodium or salt, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, can be purchased in the form of powders that can be added to water. The final, or second to final category, is everything else. This includes prepping supplies I haven't mentioned so far that may be useful in a nuclear war situation, yet may be overlooked by people prepping for a general emergency. In no particular order, you should consider a battery-operated carbon monoxide detector, if you don't already have one. If your shelter is near any fires, this could be an issue. A battery-operated carbon dioxide monitor. If you're sealing off a small area with many people in your shelter, it is possible that carbon dioxide levels could reach dangerous levels and will force you to use some ventilation, despite the radiation risk. A battery-operated or hand-crank-operated AM/FM radio, and plenty of extra batteries for all of the above. A Faraday bag, to reduce the chance that electronic devices, including the devices just mentioned, are damaged by an EMP. Most Faraday bags are designed for phones, but you can find larger ones on Amazon designed for larger devices, including laptops. Winter clothing, even if you live in a temperate climate. We don't really know to what extent nuclear winter could be a serious threat, so it's better to be prepared. This final category is for standard emergency prepping gear, which you can find on numerous YouTube channels and elsewhere, so I won't spend too much time on them here. This would include emergency food and water, fuel sources for cooking, generators for electricity, emergency medical supplies, firearms for self-defense, light sources such as candles, and so on. You should plan for living entirely off-grid. Assume that electricity, water, and gas are not available and are never coming back. The only thing I would add here is that food and water storage should be emphasized. At least a few months' worth, but more the better. It's impossible to know when you will have easy access to uncontaminated food and water again. To ensure your survival, plan for a year or more. It also may be a good idea to invest in what may become common barter items, such as tobacco, hard alcohol, and extra ammunition that could potentially be traded for necessary supplies you're running low on. I wouldn't count on silver or gold being worth much in the immediate aftermath, but they may become useful once civilization of some form is starting to come back. So that's everything I have to say on this topic, at least for now. If you want to learn more on how to prepare, there's 2 books in particular that I learned a lot from. First, Nuclear War Survival Skills, originally by Cresson Kearny, but then later updated by other authors. I would recommend getting the 2022 edition, if possible. Another is After the Flash, A Modern Guide to Nuclear Survival by Mark Rush. If you found this content useful, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. The primary content on this channel is about how to produce content anonymously online, but I may revisit prepping-related content from time to time, or whatever issue my ADHD brain happens to be interested in. If you want to support this channel, I've left a Monero donation address in the description. I've received a few donations since my last video. You know who you are, and they are very much appreciated. Thanks for watching.